In the winter of 1895, a journalist traveling through Laramie County stopped at the largest ranch in the valley to ask Caleb Morse one question. The journalist had heard the story by then. Most people in 3 territories had heard some version of it. He wanted to know what Caleb Morse, the man who had built more frontier structures than any living soul in Wyoming, considered the most important lesson of his long career. Morse was 54 years old that winter. He had hands like worn saddle leather and eyes that had seen enough hard seasons to stop counting them. He sat across from the journalist at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold between his palms, and he did not mention the 30 years. He did not mention the dozen cabins he had raised from raw timber, or the barns he had built that still stood straight against the Wyoming wind, or the fences he had run across more miles of open country than he could accurately recall. He mentioned one afternoon in January of 1888. He mentioned a thermometer on a barn wall. He mentioned a girl of 17 in a cotton dress. The journalist wrote it all down, but he could not quite capture what crossed Caleb Morse's face in the telling of it. It was not pride and it was not shame, though it contained something of both. It was the expression of a man who had been shown late in life that the thing he thought he understood best was the thing he had understood least. That is a particular kind of knowledge. It does not arrive gently. It does not leave easily. And it begins, as most hard lessons do not, with the moment of revelation, but with everything that came before it. So go back 14 months. Go back to the autumn of 1887, when the grasslands of Wyoming were still warm enough to cut, and the sky ran on forever in every direction, and a family named Vance was preparing to leave everything they had tried to build. Harold Vance was a good man. That much was never in dispute. He was honest in his dealings and gentle with his children, and he had come west with genuine faith in the land and in himself. The faith had not been enough. The land in that part of Wyoming was too dry for the crops he knew how to grow, and the winters were a different order of severity than anything he had prepared for, and after 2 years of fighting a losing battle against both, the debt had accumulated to a point where the arithmetic was impossible to argue with. His wife Margaret had been sick through most of the second winter, a deep rattling sickness that lived in her chest and would not leave. His older son Owen had found work in Pittsburgh before the family ever came west and had returned to help them pack, with the settled certainty of a man who had always known this would be the outcome. The other children were young enough to be carried forward into whatever came next, without grieving too hard for what was left behind. Eleanor was the exception. She was 17 years old, and she had been born on the wagon journey west, which meant she had no memory of anywhere else. The grasslands were not a compromise to her. They were not a second choice or an adventure or a calculated risk. They were simply the world. The particular quality of light in the late afternoon, when the whole plain turned gold, and the shadows of the grass stretched long, and the wind came down from the north, carrying something that smelled like distance itself that was not scenery to Eleanor Vance. That was home in the oldest and most irreducible sense of the word. She argued, she pleaded. She laid out what she believed were reasonable cases for staying one after another until her father's silence became a kind of answer. And the silence of her mother, thin and exhausted in her chair by the stove, confirmed it. The decision had been made in that place where family decisions are truly made, somewhere behind the spoken words, in the weight of exhaustion and the arithmetic of survival. It was Owen who delivered the final word. He found her in the barn on the evening before the last standing among the few remaining animals, with her hand on the neck of the old roan mare that had been hers since she was 12 years old. Owen was 26, and he carried himself with the particular authority of the eldest child who has been proven right. He was not cruel. Eleanor would say that much for him even later, even when the memory of his words had calcified into something she could not quite forgive. He was not cruel, he was certain. "Ellie," he said from the barn door, "you're going to die out here before Christmas, or you're going to walk into town and beg for a train ticket. Either way, you're making a fool of yourself. There's nothing here for you." He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather, not as a threat or a wish, as an observable truth about the world. Eleanor stood with her hand on the mare's neck and did not answer him, and Owen took the silence for what he needed it to be and went back to the house. That night, past midnight, there was a soft knock at her door. Harold came in and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and was quiet for a long time, the way men of his generation were quiet when they were carrying something they could not put down and could not explain. Eleanor lay still and waited. Outside, the wind moved across the grass with its low, continuous murmur. "I don't have another choice, Ellie," her father said finally. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his own hands, which were resting on his knees. "I know, Papa," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder for one moment, just one, the weight of it deliberate and brief. And then he stood and left the room, and Eleanor lay in the dark and listened to the wind and understood that the conversation was over and that there would not be another one. In the morning, they left her with the cabin, the barn, 50 pounds of flour, a small store of dried goods, and a cast iron stove that was better suited to a larger space than anything she would need to heat. The wagon disappeared over the low ridge to the east, and the dust settled, and then there was nothing in any direction except the grass and the ski and the silence that follows departure. Eleanor stood at the edge of the yard for a while. Then she turned around and looked at what remained. The cabin was the better built of the two structures. 2 rooms of felled cottonwood tightly chinked with windows that caught the afternoon light. It was by frontier standards respectable. Eleanor had lived in it through 2 winters, and she knew its secret. It was beautiful in the way that a leaking boat is beautiful, fine to look at, insufficient to trust. The windows were generous enough for summer and devastating in January. The rooms were large enough that the stove spent most of its energy trying to heat the air between the walls rather than the person sitting in front of it. She had watched her mother stuff rags into the baseboards every single evening of 2 consecutive winters, and she had watched those rags freeze stiff by morning every single time. 5 cords of wood. That was what the cabin demanded for a full winter, and wood had to be hauled 10 miles from the nearest stand of cottonwood along the creek, which meant it was not simply expensive, but genuinely scarce. She had watched her father's face each time they came back from the hauling, the calculation running behind his eyes, the slow recognition that the winter was going to take more than they had. In February of the second year, the wood had run out, and they had burned a chair and then part of a workbench, and the temperature inside the cabin had still dropped to 45 degrees on the coldest nights, which was barely enough to keep the frost off the inside of the walls. The cabin was a losing proposition. Eleanor had understood this with a clarity she could not have fully articulated, but did not need to. She felt it in the same way she felt the direction of the wind before she stepped outside. It was knowledge that lived in the body before it reached the mind. The barn was different, smaller, lower ceiling, thick-joined timbers that had been selected for strength rather than appearance. No windows, only a pair of narrow ventilation gaps near the roofline. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable. But it was structurally honest in a way the cabin was not. It admitted what it was without pretending to be more. And it was something Eleanor could work with. The idea did not come to her all at once. It came the way the solutions to physical problems usually come through the accumulation of small observations over a long period of time, until one day the observations arrange themselves into something that looks obvious. She had helped her father dig the storm cellar in the summer of her 14th year. She remembered stepping down into it on an August afternoon when the heat above ground was brutal enough to make the air above the grass shimmer and distort. The cellar was cool, not merely less hot, cool in a way that felt deliberate, as though the earth were doing something on purpose. She had stood at the bottom of the ladder and pressed her palm against the soil wall and felt it, that steady, calm temperature that did not fluctuate with the sun or the wind, that held itself at something close to 50 degrees through every season without any effort at all. She had watched badgers work their burrows into the hillside south of the property, and she had watched coyotes find shelter in deep earthen dens during the worst nights. The animals were not stupid. They had been solving this problem for longer than anyone had been building cabins, and their solution was always the same. They did not fight the cold. They got below it. The barn was not underground, but it could be made to behave as though part of it were. The physics of it resolved in her mind on a Sunday afternoon in late September, while she was sitting on the fence rail watching the light change over the grass. She thought about what the cold actually did. Not the cold itself, but the mechanism of it. Wind stripped heat from surfaces. That was the primary weapon. A 30-mile-an-hour wind did not just chill the air around a structure. It actively pulled warmth through the walls, dragging it outward through convection, a continuous theft that no fire could fully compensate for. The stove was not heating the cabin. It was trying to replace what the wind was taking, and it was always losing. What if the wind could not reach the walls? A second wall outside the first. Not wood, because wood was expensive and scarce and required skilled joinery to keep it tight, But sod was neither of those things. Sod was the one material she had in infinite supply. The buffalo grass on the open plain had been building a dense, fibrous root mat for centuries, and the result was a material that was heavier than stone that held its shape once cut, that packed tight against itself and grew more solid over time rather than less. She would build a sod wall 3 feet thick along the north face of the barn, and the west face the two directions from which the winter storms always came. She would leave a 2-foot gap between the outer sod wall and the barn's timber wall. That gap would trap air. Still air, not moving air. Still air is one of the finest insulators that exists, and in the gap between the two walls, the wind would never reach it. Beyond that, the thick earthen wall would absorb whatever heat the winter sun provided during the daylight hours and release it slowly through the night, smoothing out the brutal temperature swings that made every frontier winter feel like fighting two enemies at once, the cold itself and the cold that came after. She explained none of this to anyone. There was no one to explain it to. She found the sod cutter behind the barn, half buried under blown debris, its iron blades still sound. It was designed to be pulled by a team of oxen, which she did not have. She drove a heavy iron stake into the ground, 50 feet out, ran a rope from the cutter to the stake, and used a length of oak branch as a lever to winch it tight after each push of the blade. It was agonizingly slow. Each pull advanced the cut by 6 inches. She worked from the first gray light of morning until she could no longer see clearly in the evening, and at the end of the first day, she had enough material for perhaps 2 courses of a single wall section. On the third day, a boy appeared on the county road and slowed to a stop, watching her. He was 14 years old, lean, and serious-faced, with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned to read situations carefully before committing to them. His name was Danny Holt, and his family worked a small claim at the far end of the valley. He stood on the road for a while, then he came through the fence gate without being invited and stood closer. Eleanor did not acknowledge him. She was managing the rope, bracing her feet against the ground, pulling. "What are you building?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She finished the pull, set the lever, and straightened her back. "Hold that end," she said, pointing to the rope. He held it. They worked through the rest of the afternoon in something that was not quite companionable, silence, but was functional and sufficient. When the light finally failed and Eleanor called a stop, Danny coiled the rope with the practiced efficiency of a boy who had been doing farm work since he could walk. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked. Eleanor considered him. "If you want," she said. He came back the next day and the day after that. 2 weeks after the work began, Ruth Calloway rode over from her place 2 miles down the road. Ruth was 45, widowed 3 years prior, with the careful eyes of a woman who has survived enough difficulty to take the measure of new difficulty quickly. She brought a jar of apple butter and sat with Eleanor during the noon break and watched the half-built wall with an expression that Eleanor could not quite read. She had promised to check in. She was keeping the promise. That was something. "How are you managing for food?" Ruth asked. "Well enough for now," Eleanor said. Ruth nodded. She did not push. When she left, she put her hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder, the same gesture her father had made on his last night, and Eleanor felt the echo of it and did not let it show on her face. 3 days later, Caleb Morse rode up. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something resembling a topographic map of his own history. He had built more structures in that valley than any other single man, and people consulted him on matters of construction the way they consulted the pastor on matters of the soul. He dismounted, looped his reins over the fence post, and walked a slow circuit around the emerging wall, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow set in a particular expression that Eleanor recognized as a professional evaluation of something that offended professional sensibility. He stopped in front of her. Eleanor kept working. "Elizabeth," he began, then corrected himself. "Eleanor, what in God's name are you doing here?" "Improving the barn," she said. She did not stop working. Morse crouched and pressed his palm against the base of the wall. It was solid, packed tight, the courses laid with a precision that surprised him. He stood back up. "This is a mistake," he said, "not as an opinion, as a statement of established fact. You're putting wet earth against timber. That wall is going to sweat all winter. The moisture works into the main posts. By spring, you have got rot starting. By the following winter, the structure becomes a hazard." Eleanor set down the brick she was holding. She looked at him directly. "The moisture can't reach the timber," she said. "There's a 2-foot gap between the sod and the wood, and by the time the outer wall freezes solid, it acts as a vapor barrier. The interior stays dry. Morse opened his mouth and then closed it again. It was a small hesitation, barely visible, but Eleanor saw it. Something in her argument had snagged on something in his knowledge, and he had no immediate answer. He recovered. "The gap just gives the rats a place to winter," he said. "You're going to freeze in here, or the roof will come down on you. You should come work in my kitchen. Mrs. Morse could use the help." "I'm fine here, Mr. Morse," Eleanor said. He climbed back onto his horse. He looked down at her from the additional height with an expression she had seen before on older men who were accustomed to being listened to. "Don't come to me when the walls start weeping," he said. He turned the horse and rode back toward the road. Eleanor watched him go. She watched him for longer than was necessary because she was looking for something specific. And there, about 200 yards out, Caleb Morse turned in the saddle and looked back at the wall. One long look. Then he faced forward and rode on. Eleanor picked up the next brick and laid it in place. The week that followed brought the kind of social weather that small communities generate around anything that deviates from expectation. Word had spread the way word always spread in places where entertainment was scarce, and the story it carried was the story of the crazy Vance girl who had been left behind and had lost her mind to grief and was burying a perfectly good barn under tons of dirt. People rode out of their way down the county road to have a look. They slowed their horses and pointed and talked among themselves. At the trading post, a freighter named Silas Pruitt made a joke in front of a crowd that Eleanor still carries with her. She had ridden in for salt and kerosene, and she was tying her horse to the rail when his voice came from the porch, loud and aimed at the assembled audience of men and idlers. "Look what the prairie dug up. The Vance girl. I heard you're building yourself a tomb out there, Ellie, digging your own grave to save the undertaker the trouble." There was laughter, the particular laughter of men who are cold and bored and willing to spend their sympathy on something cheaper than actual concern. Eleanor kept her head down and went into the store and bought what she came for and left without meeting anyone's eyes. Danny was there. He had been inside picking up a pound of nails for his father. He came out behind her and fell into step. He did not say anything for a while. They walked to their horses. "My father once dug a well where everybody told him there was no water," Danny said finally. They laughed at him too. Eleanor untied her horse. "Did he find water?" she asked. 40 feet down," Danny said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she mounted and rode back toward the barn, and Danny rode his own way, and neither of them said anything more about it. Agent Abernathy came out from the county land office 2 days later, sent by someone who had sent a letter about the unconventional and potentially hazardous structure going up on the abandoned Vance property. He was a careful man, professional in his manner, and he walked the perimeter of the sod wall, making notes in a small leather-bound ledger. He tested the wall's stability with the practiced skepticism of his office. He peered at the timber frame of the barn visible above the earthen barrier. He wrote several things down. "Miss Vance," he said finally, "I've been assessing frontier structures for more than a decade. This is not anything I've encountered in any building manual or specification I've reviewed. The compressive load on the timber walls is a significant structural concern. The weight is borne by the earth itself," Eleanor said. "The wall is essentially self-supporting. The barn frame doesn't carry the load of the sod." Abernathy looked at her over his spectacles. "Are you an engineer, Miss?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'm a person who is going to be here in February." He wrote more notes. He told her the county could not be held liable for any incident arising from the structure. He filed she would later learn a brief report noting the unconventional and potentially hazardous nature of the work. He had come to document a problem. He left having spoken to someone who did not appear to know she was one. By the first week of November, the main structure was complete, 10 feet high, 3 feet thick on the north and west faces. The air gap was clean and dry. The barn itself sat behind its earthen shield like something being kept safe. Eleanor stood back and looked at what she had built. It was rough. It was primitive-looking, organic, more like a landscape feature than a building. She could hear Owen's voice in the back of her mind, the way you hear a song you don't want to remember. She could see, if she imagined, the eyes of everyone who had ridden past and pointed what they saw. But she was not building it for them to look at. She went inside, partitioned off a 10 by 10 corner of the barn with old blankets and canvas, set up the small tin stove, hung the kerosene lamp, and put a wooden crate next to the stove to serve as a table. She brought the one book she had kept from the cabin. She laid her bedroll in the corner. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. small dry flakes that the wind carried sideways across the open ground. Eleanor lit the lamp. The small flame steadied in the still air of the enclosed space. She set the book on the crate and sat down in her one chair and looked at the wall in front of her, which was just the interior timber of the barn, solid and dry and completely untouched by the wind that was beginning to move outside with purpose and intent. She placed her hand against the wood. Cool, not cold, just cool. She had no way of knowing what the winter would be. She had no way of knowing that the next 3 months would produce temperatures that would be recorded in state climatology archives for the next 100 years, or that the name given to the worst of what was coming would be earned through tragedy, or that a man named Caleb Morse would ride up to her door in the deep of January with a quarter cord of firewood on a sled prepared to perform an act of charity and find himself standing in front of a thermometer that would make everything he believed about cold and walls and the proper way to survive a Wyoming winter come apart in his hands. She had no way of knowing any of that. She only knew what the ground had told her down in the cellar in August, with her palm pressed against the cool soil wall. She knew what the badgers knew. She knew what the coyotes knew. The earth holds what the wind takes. You just have to know which one to trust. She opened her book. The lamp burned small and steady. Outside, the snow came down. On a December evening in 1887, Caleb Morse sat alone in his kitchen long after his wife had gone to bed. The lamp was turned low. The big cast-iron stove in the corner was running full the way it ran every night from October through March, consuming wood at a rate that Morse had long considered simply the cost of living in Wyoming. The thermometer on the interior wall read 46 degrees. He had checked it 3 times since supper. He was not cold exactly, but he was not warm either. He was that particular temperature that a man reaches when he has spent enough fuel to expect comfort and received something slightly less. His coat was on the back of the chair, and he had not taken it off since coming inside. He sat there with a cup of coffee going cold between his palms and thought without quite meaning to about a question Eleanor Vance had asked him 6 weeks earlier. Not a challenge, not an argument, just a question delivered in a flat, factual tone that had lodged in his memory like a splinter too deep to reach. Have you ever seen wet earth press against frozen earth? He had not answered it then. He did not have an answer for it now. He turned the coffee cup in his hands and looked at the thermometer, and looked at the stove, and looked at the wood pile visible through the kitchen window, the one he had spent 3 days in October building up to what he considered a proper reserve, and calculated in the back of his mind what rate of consumption would leave him short before the thaw. He stood up and went to the window. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were very bright the way they got when the temperature was dropping hard. He could see far down the valley the faint shape of the Vance barn against the dark skyline. No light, no smoke, nothing moving. He stood there for a while looking at nothing. Then he went to bed and did not sleep well. December settled over the valley the way it always did, with a patience that felt personal. The temperature dropped in increments, each one small enough to adjust to all of them together, adding up to something that ground at the reserves of every household in the county. Not a crisis yet, just the steady pressure of a winter doing what Wyoming winters did, which was to make every comfort that existed above ground feel provisional and temporary, and subject to revision without notice. Eleanor moved through those weeks in a rhythm that had nothing provisional about it. The corner she had made her living space was 10 feet by 10 feet, no larger. The tin stove was small enough that a grown man could carry it under one arm. She kept the fire at the minimum necessary, which was considerably less than minimum by any standard the rest of the valley would have recognized, and the space held a temperature that hovered between 50 and 54 degrees without much variation, regardless of what the wind was doing outside. She had stopped thinking about this as a remarkable achievement. It had become simply the weather inside the way the weather outside was simply the weather outside, 2 different climates separated by 3 feet of packed earth and 2 feet of still air. Danny Holt came by on a Tuesday morning in early December with a pair of rabbits he had cleaned and tied together through the back legs. He held them out without ceremony. "From me," he said in a tone that made clear it was not from his mother, regardless of what he might tell her later. Eleanor took them and hung them just inside the barn door where the cold would keep them. She looked at the boy who was stamping his feet against the chill and looking around the barn interior with the alert curiosity he brought to everything. "You want to learn something useful," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She took the small thermometer down from the wall where she had hung it, a salvaged instrument from the cabin, and showed him how to read it properly, how to note the time alongside the temperature, how to record the number in the small notebook she had been keeping since the 1st of November. Outside temperature at dawn, inside temperature at dawn, outside at midday, inside at midday, outside at dusk, inside at dusk. The notebook was already 30 pages deep with entries in her careful handwriting, columns of numbers, that told a story she had not yet needed to tell anyone. Every day, she said, you do this every day, you come and you write it down exactly. Danny took the notebook like it was something important because he understood that it was, and from that point forward, his visits had a formal structure to them that they had lacked before. He came in, read the thermometers, wrote the numbers, and then sat for a while in the warmth of the small space, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not. He was 14 years old, and he was the closest thing Eleanor had to a witness. Through Ruth Calloway, a basket appeared at the barn door one morning in the second week of December. Inside, a small round of hard bread, a paper-wrapped portion of salt pork, and a glass jar of honey sealed with wax. No note. Ruth, when Eleanor mentioned it the next time she came by, only said it was from a friend and looked away with an expression that suggested the subject was closed. Eleanor looked out toward the Morse Ranch visible on the far side of the valley as a collection of low dark shapes against the brown grass. She said nothing, but she put the honey on the shelf beside her book and understood that somewhere in that large house, in whatever calculations were being made about reserves and temperatures and the arithmetic of winter, someone had arrived at a conclusion that Caleb Morse had not yet permitted himself to speak aloud. Ruth came to see her on a Thursday, the middle of December, and she came with an offer that Eleanor had been half expecting. She sat down on the wooden crate that served as the second seat in Eleanor's living space and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the girl across from her with an expression that had more fear in it than kindness, though it was trying to be both. I have a spare room, Ruth said. It's not large, but it's warm and it's dry. Come through the winter with me. In the spring, you come back here and do whatever you're going to do. Eleanor shook her head. Ellie. Ruth leaned forward. The fear in her face had shifted into something sharper. You are being stubborn to the point of stupidity, and I say that because I care what happens to you. I do not want to find out in March that you froze to death 50 yards from a warm house because you were too proud to walk through a door. Eleanor looked at her steadily, not with anger, with the particular patience of someone who has already had the argument with themselves and reached a conclusion. If you want to help me, Eleanor said, then believe me, that's the only thing I need from anyone right now. Ruth sat back. She looked at the thermometer on the wall. She looked at the small stove, burning low and quiet. She looked at the frost-free timbers of the barn, dry and cool to the touch. Nothing like the rime-coated walls of the cabin she had been expecting. The silence stretched out between them. I don't know what I believe, Ruth said finally, and it was the most honest sentence anyone had spoken to Eleanor in months. She left shortly after. 2 weeks passed without a visit, and the silence of those 2 weeks sat in Eleanor's chest in a way the cold outside did not. She was accustomed to solitude. She was not yet accustomed to the specific weight of being known by someone who had chosen for reasons of their own fear to stand at a distance and watch. She kept working. She kept recording. She added the numbers to the notebook each day and let the data accumulate the way snow accumulates, one entry at a time, into something that would eventually bear weight. The 8th of January arrived and announced itself by dropping the trading post thermometer to 8 degrees below zero overnight. People noticed. They did the mental calculations they had been putting off and found the numbers unwelcome. The 10th was 25 below. On the morning of the 12th, the air was strange. Mild almost. The kind of January morning in Wyoming that makes you suspicious because the land has no reason to be generous in January, and when it seems to be, it is usually reorganizing itself for something worse. Children were sent to school. Men went out to their barns to do the work that had been too cold to do the past several days. Women aired out rooms that had been sealed against the chill. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had fallen 40 degrees. The wind came from the northwest without announcement, a full gale carrying snow so fine and dry, it behaved less like precipitation and more like a substance the air itself had become. Visibility dropped to arm's length inside of 10 minutes. The wind chill reached 60 below zero and kept going. The snow did not fall so much as move horizontally, a white wall of it that found every gap and seam in every structure in the valley and probed each one with cold, methodical intensity. Inside the sod-walled barn, Eleanor heard it. She was sitting at her crate table with the book open and the lamp burning when the world outside the walls changed character entirely. The storm did not announce itself subtly. It arrived the way catastrophic things arrive fully and without apology. The sound of it reached her as something between a roar and a moan, a frequency she could feel in the floor as much as hear through the walls. She put her hand on the interior timber of the barn wall. Cool, unchanged. She looked at the thermometer, 54 degrees. The stove was burning at its normal low setting, 4 small sections of wood, the amount she used on any ordinary evening. She did not add more. There was no need to add more. The storm outside was doing its worst against the outer face of the sod wall, stripping heat from the surface of the earth, with the full violence of one of the worst blizzards in Wyoming's recorded history, and none of that violence reached the timber frame she was sitting inside of. The barn held what it had been given. That was all. That was enough. She wrote in the notebook, January 12th, 11 p.m. Interior temperature 54 degrees. Fuel consumed today 4 sections. She estimated the outside temperature at something below 35 degrees negative and left the precise figure blank because she had no way to measure it. Then she sat back and listened to the storm beat itself against the earth and got nowhere. And after a while, she picked up the book and found her place and kept reading. The second night of the blizzard, the knock came. It was faint, almost too faint to hear over the wind, which had not diminished. Eleanor set the book down and held still, not certain she had heard it. Then it came again, a little stronger, the sound of knuckles against heavy wood. She opened the barn door against the pressure of the wind, and Danny Holt fell half inside. He was not dressed for the kind of cold that was outside. He had on his regular coat, the one he wore for daily chores, and his boots and a scarf that had come partially unwound, and his face was the color of old ash, and his lips had gone a shade of purple that Eleanor recognized as a color that needed immediate attention. She pulled him in and got the door shut and pushed him toward the stove without waiting for him to speak. "Sit," she said. He sat. He was shaking so hard she could hear it, a fine continuous tremor that she had seen in calves pulled from cold water. She got the blanket off the bed and put it around his shoulders and put the tin cup of water that had been sitting warm on top of the stove into his hands and closed his fingers around it. She waited. It took several minutes for the shaking to reduce itself to something manageable. "My father," he said, his voice rough. "He went out to check the cattle when the storm hit, and he fell. Slipped on the ice. His wrist is bad. He can't move it." He paused to breathe. "And the cattle, 3 of them got out of the near pasture when the gate blew. I don't know where they went." Eleanor looked at him. The color was coming back to his face in slow patches. "Your mother is with your father?" "Yes." "Is he in the house?" "Yes." "Warm enough." Danny nodded. "Then he is all right for tonight," Eleanor said. "You are going to sleep here. In the morning, when there is light enough to see, we will go find the cattle." Danny opened his mouth to say something about his mother, or his father, or the propriety of sleeping in Eleanor Vance's barn, and Eleanor looked at him with an expression that ended the conversation before it began. She gave him the bedroll. She sat up through most of the night in the chair, keeping the stove at a temperature sufficient for a boy who had nearly frozen, and she listened to the storm work itself into historical proportions outside the walls, and she was not afraid. She was occupied. There is a difference. By the time gray morning light showed at the ventilation gaps near the roofline, the wind had dropped to something navigable. Eleanor woke Danny at first light. They dressed in everything available. She pulled on the heavy wool coat she kept on the peg by the door, and Danny rewound his scarf, and they went out into a world that had been redesigned overnight. The snow had drifted to the eaves of the cabin on the north side. The fence lines were buried. The county road was indistinguishable from the surrounding fields. The air was still and devastating, the cold that follows a blizzard, always more absolute than the cold within it, a finished cold, a cold that has done what it intended. They found the 3 cattle in the low ground behind the Holt property's north fence, huddled together in the lee of a small rise, alive but barely mobile. Getting them back to the barn took 2 hours of work that Eleanor would not describe to anyone afterward, because it was the kind of work that exists purely in the doing of it, not in the telling. Inside the Holt calf barn, Eleanor stood and looked at the north wall. The wind had found every gap between the boards, and the frost inside the structure was an inch thick on the interior surfaces. 2 of the animals that had remained in the barn had not survived the night. They stood where they had been standing when the cold took them, which was a thing Eleanor had seen before and hoped not to see again. She did not say anything about insulation or earth or air gaps. She only looked at the north wall for a moment and then looked at Danny. Next spring, she said, we fix this. He nodded as though she had said something he already knew. Inside the house, his father lay on the kitchen bench with his right wrist bound in a splint of board and rag. He was a raw-boned man named Samuel Holt, 40 years old, with the lean, stoic quality of someone for whom physical hardship was simply the medium of daily life rather than an exceptional condition. He looked at Eleanor when she came in, and there was something in his look that was not quite gratitude but was in the direction of it. Your boy slept warm, Eleanor said. Holt nodded. He understood what she was telling him and what she was not saying about the circumstances under which his son had needed to sleep somewhere warmer than home. She and Danny walked back to the barn in the thin light of mid-morning, their breath coming in short white clouds, the snow squeaking under their boots with the sound it makes only at the most severe temperatures. Neither of them knew, walking back across that white, silent field, that the blizzard which had just passed was only the opening statement of a winter that intended to make its point at length. The storm broke on the 15th. The cold did not. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer did not climb above zero. The valley entered a kind of suspended crisis that each family managed according to whatever reserves they had and whatever intelligence they had brought to the problem of winter before it arrived. The Colby Ranch, the largest operation in the area, burned through 2 cords of prime cottonwood per week and held their main house at 42 degrees. Their bunkhouse became uninhabitable on the 4th day, and the hands moved into the kitchen, which meant the kitchen was always crowded and never quite warm enough for anyone in it. A family named Greer, 3 miles east, ran out of seasoned wood and began burning green timber, which produced a dense wet smoke that coated their chimney flue with creosote. The chimney caught fire on the 21st of January. They were fortunate to lose only the chimney. Inside the barn on the Vance property, Danny recorded the numbers every morning. January 14th, outside -22, inside 56 degrees, fuel consumed 4 sections. January 18th, outside -29, inside 53 degrees. Fuel consumed 5 sections owing to an unusually clear night with strong radiative cooling. January 21st, outside -31, inside 55 degrees. Fuel consumed 4 sections. The notebook was filling up. On a clear afternoon around the 20th, with the sun out, but contributing almost nothing thermal to the landscape, Caleb Morse rode out to check on a herd of cattle he had wintered in the south pasture. His route took him along the county road past the Vance property, as it sometimes did. He was not planning to stop. He saw the smoke first, or rather, he saw what the smoke was not. It was not the thick, rolling column of a stove being pushed hard. It was not the dark, laboring output of a firefighting for every degree it could produce. It was a thin, pale line rising straight into the still air, the kind of smoke that came from a fire burning at a moderate, comfortable pace, the kind of smoke you would see from a kitchen stove on a mild October morning when there was no particular urgency to anything. He stopped his horse. The temperature that afternoon was approximately 20 degrees below zero. He sat on the horse for a long moment, looking at that thin line of smoke. Then he looked at the barn itself. The earthen wall along its north and west faces the rough organic profile of it against the white field. He had ridden past this structure a dozen times since October, and each time had confirmed to himself that the girl had made a mistake, that the spring would prove him right, that the county land office report would turn out to have been the appropriate response. He was looking at a fire that should not have been that small. He rode on. He checked the cattle, 2 of which had developed ice in their eyelashes that needed attention. He did the work. He rode back. And the image of that thin, pale line of smoke came with him all the way home and sat across the table from him at supper that night, patient and unexplained, while the temperature inside his own house read 48 degrees and the woodpile outside shrank at a rate that Clara had been recording in her own handwriting for 6 weeks. Clara set a piece of paper on the table in front of him after supper. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. She had married Caleb Morse knowing what she was choosing and had made the most of every good thing in that choice and managed the rest without complaint. But practicality in her interpretation did not mean pretending that numbers were different from what they were. The paper in front of him was covered in her careful columns. Dates. Temperatures measured inside the house, which she had been recording every morning while he was in the barn. Fuel consumed estimated by her count of the woodpile. Projected remaining supply at current burn rate. If the winter continued at its present severity for another 3 weeks, which was not an unreasonable expectation, they would exhaust their reserves by mid-February. Caleb looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "I've been sending food to the Vance girl," Clara said, "through Ruth Calloway, since November." She said it the way she said things that were not requests and were not confessions, but were simply facts being delivered to someone who needed to have them. I thought she might know something we didn't. Caleb did not look up from the paper. "Your man Crawford has 2 fingers that are white," Clara said. "He showed me this morning. He won't say anything to you because he's afraid of seeming soft." The kitchen was quiet. The stove was running full. The thermometer on the wall read 48 degrees. Caleb Morse sat at the table with his wife's calculations in front of him and the image of a thin line of smoke in his memory, and for the first time in 3 decades of building and maintaining frontier structures in Wyoming, he sat with a question he could not answer. He did not sleep well that night either. January 23rd came in at -38. Caleb Morse loaded a quarter quart of his best firewood onto the sled before dawn, working in the dark by lantern light. He did not tell Clara where he was going, but she watched him from the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands in the expression of a woman who already knows. He hitched the sled to the draft horse and rode out into a morning so cold that each breath arrived in the lungs as a distinct physical event, a brief clean pain that reminded you at every inhalation exactly what you were dealing with. He told himself all in way across the frozen valley that he was going to check on the girl, that it was a charitable errand, that he expected to find her in some version of distress that would allow him to deliver the wood and perhaps some sensible advice about coming to stay somewhere warm for the remainder of the winter. He had the speech organized in his head. It was a kind speech, generous in tone, with nothing of "I told you so" in it, or almost nothing. He tied the horse to the fence post and knocked on the heavy barn door. A pause, then it opened. The warmth came first. Before he saw her face, before he took in anything about the interior, the warmth hit him. Not the blast of dry, overheated air that came out of a structure being kept warm by brute force, the aggressive heat of a fire running at maximum effort. This was something different. This was the warmth of a space that had simply retained what it was given, that had not been surrendering heat to the outside all night and then scrambling to replace it all morning. It was a settled warmth, a warmth that had been there long enough to be ordinary. Eleanor was wearing a cotton dress over a wool shirt. No coat. Her cheeks were their natural color. Her hair was not matted with the frost that accumulated on everything and everyone outside after more than a few minutes of exposure. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something but was willing to be civil about it. He stepped inside without quite being invited. He was not going to stop himself. He needed to understand what he was standing in. The space was small, the partitioned corner she had made her home, and it was lit by the kerosene lamp and the faint glow of the tin stove, which was doing the least impressive thing a stove could do while still technically operating. He had never seen a fire that small, heating a space that warm. His eyes found the thermometer on the timber post. He walked to it. He bent and looked. The mercury sat at 58 degrees. He straightened up slowly. He looked at the stove. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching him with no particular expression. He looked at the woodpile against the wall, which, after what he now knew had been weeks of the worst cold in Wyoming history, contained enough wood to suggest she had used almost none of it. "We're burning half a quart a week," he said. His voice sounded different than he expected, quieter. "To hold 48 degrees. Eleanor said nothing. He sat down in her only chair. She did not object. He sat there for a long moment and looked at the thermometer and looked at the stove and looked at his own hands, which were still white with cold from the ride over despite his heavy gloves. His man Crawford's 2 white fingers, the cattle with ice in their eyelashes, the paper covered in Clara's columns. "I built the Aldrich cabin in 1861, he said to no one in particular, to the floor, to the thermometer. "I built the Morrison barn in 1869. I've put up more structures in this county than any other man alive, and every one of them is fighting the winter the same wrong way. Brute force, more wood, more fire, more of the same thing that isn't working, just more of it." The stove ticked quietly. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words. He had said harder things in his life, or things he had believed were harder at the time. But those 3 words cost him something. He could feel leaving some assumption about himself and his knowledge that had been there so long. It had become part of the structure, and now it was gone, and the structure was still standing, which surprised him. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Would you like some tea?" she said. He looked up. Whatever he had been expecting her to say, it was not that. He nodded. She moved to the stove and set the kettle on, and neither of them spoke while it heated and the stove burned small and steady, and the thermometer held 58 degrees, while the world outside performed its worst at -38, and Caleb Morse sat in Eleanor Vance's only chair and felt 30 years of certainty rearrange itself into something he did not yet have a name for. What he did not know, sitting in that chair, was that far to the east, in a house in Pittsburgh, a man named Harold Vance had recently received a letter from an acquaintance passing through Wyoming. The letter was brief and factual, the way letters between men who are not close tend to be. It said that his daughter was alive. It said she had built something that people were talking about. It said he thought Vance would want to know. Harold had read the letter 3 times. He had put it in his coat pocket. He had not shown it to Owen, who was living 2 streets over and doing well at the shipping company. He had not discussed it with Margaret, who was stronger this winter than the last, the city air agreeing with her in ways the Wyoming air had not. He had carried it in his coat pocket for 11 days without telling anyone. Some knowledge is too large to share until you understand what to do with it. Some things a father has to hold alone for a while, turning them over in the private dark of his own conscience before he can decide what they mean and what he owes. The tea was hot and plain, and Caleb Morse drank it in the warmth of a barn that should have been cold, surrounded by the evidence of a winter's worth of something he was only beginning to understand how to call by its right name. Outside, the cold continued. It had 23 days in it still, though no one knew that yet. And in the notebook on the shelf above the thermometer in Danny Holt's careful 14-year-old handwriting, the numbers kept accumulating one day at a time into a record that no one had asked for and everyone would eventually need. February arrived the way survivors arrive, quietly without ceremony, carrying evidence of what it had come through. The temperature did not warm all at once. It released its grip in small increments over the first 2 weeks of the month, a degree here, 2 degrees there, as if the cold were not retreating so much as slowly losing interest. The snow that had been preserved in its original fallen shape for weeks began to change character at the edges, softening slightly at midday before refreezing at night into a harder, more consolidated surface. The valley was still white. It would be white for another 6 weeks. But the quality of the light had changed, and the animals knew it before the people did, and the people knew it in the back of their bones before they knew it in their minds. Eleanor was sitting at her crate table on a morning in early February when she opened the notebook and looked at the full record for the first time with the intention of actually reading it rather than adding to it. Danny had been keeping it faithfully since December. The entries were in both their handwritings, hers in the earlier pages and his in the later ones, the columns precise and undecorated temperatures and fuel tallies and nothing else. She turned through the pages slowly. The numbers told a story that did not require interpretation. They simply sat on the page and were what they were, and what they were was this: through the worst recorded winter in Wyoming's documented history, she had maintained a living temperature in a 10 by 10 foot space using a quantity of fuel that the winter had no answer for. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf and did not think about it in terms of triumph. She thought about it the way she thought about most things that had worked, which was to note that it had worked and consider what the working of it meant for what came next. What came next, she had decided, was spring. And after spring, another winter. And the winter after that. She was still here. She intended to remain here. Those were the only 2 facts that mattered to the immediate future. The community's reckoning with what it had endured came in stages, the way it always does. First, the tallying of losses. The Colby Ranch had lost 11 head of cattle, 2 horses, and 6 weeks of productivity from hands who had spent the coldest period simply trying to keep themselves and the animals alive, rather than doing the work ranches required. A family named Brant, who had arrived the previous spring and were not yet settled into the rhythms of the place, had suffered badly. Their youngest child had spent 2 weeks in a fever following the blizzard, the kind of fever that took children in those years, and had come out the other side diminished in ways that would take time to understand. The Greer chimney fire had cost them their main heat source for 2 weeks, and they had survived by moving in with neighbors, which created its own costs and pride and obligation that would be repaid slowly over the following year. Then came the accounting of what had worked and what had not. This was the harder conversation. Caleb Morse did not seek it out. It came to him in the form of questions at the trading post at the one-room church where the community gathered on Sundays, in the casual exchanges at fence lines, when men stopped to talk about their winter damage and what they might do differently. People had seen him ride to the Vance barn. People had seen him come back without the wood he had taken. In a community that small, the trajectory of a sled could become a subject of interpretation. Thomas Greer asked him about it directly one morning at the post while Morse was loading supplies. Greer was a fair man who had lost a chimney and was not interested in assigning blame so much as in understanding, and he asked in that spirit. "What did you find out there?" Greer said. "That made you come back empty-handed." Morse set a sack of flour on the sled and took a moment. "A thermometer reading 58 degrees, he said, on the coldest morning of the winter. Greer was quiet for a moment. He had been burning through his wood faster than he had planned for all of January, and had told himself the winter was simply worse than usual, which was true without asking whether worse than usual might require a different response than more of the same. "How," he said. "Earth," Morse said. She wrapped the north and west walls in 3 feet of sod and left an air gap between the earth and the timber. The wind never touched the barn. The stove ran low the whole winter. Greer looked at him. "That works." "I stood in 58 degrees at minus 38 outside," Morse said. "With a fire I could have kicked out with my boot. You tell me if it works." Silas Pruitt was at the other end of the porch during this exchange. He had lost a significant portion of his hog operation to the cold animals he had not adequately sheltered because he had not believed the winter would be what it turned out to be, or perhaps because he had believed and chosen not to act on the belief, which was a different kind of failure. He had been carrying that loss in the tight-set way men carry losses they cannot discuss without confronting the decisions that led to them. "Could have been luck," Silas said from down the porch. "Small barn, easy to heat anyway. Not everybody's got a structure like that to work with." Morse turned and looked at him with the particular look of a man who is deciding how much of what he actually thinks to say. "Silas," he said, "I told that girlie her walls would rot and her roof would come in on her. I told her to come work in my kitchen. I have been burning through my reserve all winter, holding 48 degrees in a house I built myself. She held 58 in a barn." He paused. "If you want to call that luck, you can, but I'd be careful about what decisions you make based on that conclusion." Silas said nothing. He looked at the middle distance for a moment and then walked inside the store, and the conversation was over and the porch was quiet. It was not a graceful moment, and it was not meant to be. But it was the moment the community's version of the story began to shift from the crazy Vance girl to something that did not yet have a name. Agent Abernathy returned to the Vance property on a Thursday in late February, and this time he came because Morse had written to him. He brought a calibrated thermometer in a padded case and a new ledger and an expression that contained considerably less official certainty than it had in the autumn. Eleanor showed him in. He conducted his measurements with the precision of a man who understood that what he recorded here would have a longer life than his own opinion of it. Outside temperature 12 below zero, a moderate day, by the standards of what the valley had just come through. Inside temperature 51 degrees, the stove at its customary low burn. He sat at the crate table and went through Danny's notebook page by page. He did not rush. He asked Eleanor 2 clarifying questions about her methodology, both of which she answered briefly and accurately. He wrote for a long time in his own ledger. "You measured every day," he said. It was not quite a question. "Danny Holt measured," Eleanor said. "He's 14. He can read a thermometer and write a number. That's all it required." Abernathy looked up at that. Something in it had caught him. "You taught the boy to record the data," he said. "I showed him how to read the instrument and write the time alongside the number. He did the rest." Abernathy wrote something in the ledger. Then he looked around the small space, the dry timber walls, the frost-free corners, the surface of the stove that was warm to the touch, but not hot, the shelf with the book and the honey jar and the notebook. "When I came in October," he said, "I wrote that this structure was unconventional and potentially hazardous." "I remember," Eleanor said. "I'm going to write a different report," he said. He came back 2 days later with a draft of what he intended to submit to the Territorial Agricultural Extension. He read portions of it aloud to Eleanor, which was not standard practice and which he did anyway. It was technical in its language, careful in its claims, and built entirely on the numbers in Danny's notebook and the measurements Abernathy had taken himself. It described the structural approach in precise terms. It noted the fuel consumption against interior temperature across a winter that the meteorological record would confirm as one of the most severe in the territory's history. In the final paragraph, he had written a single line of attribution developed and implemented by a homesteader in Laramie County through independent observation and practical application. Morse was present for this reading. He had ridden over that morning and was sitting on an upturned bucket near the door, which was the only remaining seating after Eleanor had the crate and Abernathy had the chair. When Abernathy finished reading, Morse looked up. "Call it the Vance Wall," he said. Abernathy paused. Naming a technique after a specific individual was not common in agricultural extension publications. There were conventions about these things. "Mr. Morse," Abernathy began. "Thomas Abernathy," Morse said, "you and I both know that a dozen men in this county looked at what she built and told her it was going to kill her. I was one of them. The technique exists because she ignored every one of us. If you want to put a name on it that honors the convention of your office, do that. But if you want to put the right name on it, it's the Vance Wall." Abernathy looked at his draft for a moment. Then he added a sentence to the attribution line. He read it aloud, commonly referred to in Laramie County as the Vance Wall, after the homesteader who first developed and tested the method. Eleanor was looking at the floor when he read it. She did not say anything for a moment. "That's fine," she said. It was not the response of someone who had been waiting for recognition. It was the response of someone who had been waiting for the winter to end and was now beginning to think about spring. Ruth Calloway came to the Sunday gathering at the church 2 weeks into February for the first time since before Christmas. She had been unwell for part of January, not with anything specific, but with the accumulated weight of a hard winter spent alone in a cabin, managing on her own reserves and her own company. She came in and sat in her usual pew and looked to those who knew her face like someone who had arrived with a purpose beyond worship. The gathering after the service was when people talked standing in the thin February light outside the church door with their coats pulled close, exchanging the news and assessments that a community uses to take its own measure. The Vance Wall had become a regular subject. People who had not yet decided what they thought about it were listening to people who had, and somewhere in between those positions, the community was working out its collective response. Ruth waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation, the kind that happens when a group has been talking for a while and pauses to breathe. Then she spoke. She was not a woman who addressed public gatherings. She was not built for performance. Her voice when she started was not steady, and she did not try to make it steady. She let it be what it was. "I want to say something," she said. "I want people here to know that I was wrong about Eleanor Vance. I went to her twice and tried to convince her to give up what she was doing and come stay with me. The second time, I was not kind about it. I told her she was being stubborn to the point of stupidity." She paused. "If she had listened to me, we would not have anything to learn from this winter. I want her to know that, and I want all of you to know it, because I think the things that are worth saying should be said where they can be heard." The group was quiet. Morse was standing near the back of it, and he looked at his boots. Thomas Greer nodded slowly. Several people looked at each other with the expression of individuals who are recognizing in someone else's courage, a courage they wish they had exercised themselves. Ruth folded her hands in front of her and said nothing else. She had said what she came to say. The words spread from that gathering outward, the way words spread in communities where people are paying attention through the households and fence-line conversations and trading post-exchanges over the following weeks. By the time the snow began its serious retreat in March 7, families in the valley were making plans to build Vance walls before the following autumn. Not a mass movement, not a revolution. 7 families who had spent a winter being cold while someone a mile away had been reading by lamplight in 55-degree comfort, and who had arrived at the conclusion that this difference was worth understanding and worth replicating. The Miller family was the first to complete theirs in the 3rd week of April, when the ground was soft enough to cut. Robert Miller and his son worked for 2 weeks on the north face of their cabin, the face that had given them the most trouble through 3 consecutive winters, and they built their wall to the dimensions that Abernathy's bulletin had specified: 3 feet thick, 2-foot gap courses laid grass side down. It was rougher than Eleanor's work and took them longer than they expected, and when it was done, it looked, as Robert Miller said to his wife, like the cabin had grown a new skin. The following winter, they burned less than half what they had burned the winter before. They lived in a house that held 50 degrees without effort, and their children were not sick, and Robert Miller did not once lie awake calculating whether the wood would last. He rode over to the Vance property in December to tell Eleanor this. She listened and nodded and said she was glad. It was not a long visit. Danny Holt turned 15 in the spring and spent that first warm season doing 2 things: helping his father rebuild the family's cattle operation, which had taken real losses, and spending every available afternoon at the Vance property learning everything Eleanor would teach him. He had progressed well beyond thermometer reading by then. He understood the directional logic of the wall placement, why north and west and not the others. He understood the relationship between wall thickness and the depth of the frost line. He understood what happened to the thermal performance if the air gap was compromised, if something was stored in it, if the outer wall was built too thin at the base. He was not a student in any formal sense. He was a boy who wanted to understand how things worked and had found in Eleanor Vance someone who had no patience for the version of knowledge that lived only in the telling rather than the doing. In the early summer, his father came to him and asked him to explain in plain terms what exactly they were going to do to the cattle barn that autumn. Danny explained it. Samuel Holt listened to his son describe the wall placement and the gap and the earthen mass without interrupting, his face carrying the particular expression of a father who is hearing his child say something that surprises him with its clarity and confidence. When Danny finished, Samuel said, "Where did you learn all that?" "Miss Vance," Danny said. His father was quieter for a moment. He looked out toward the Vance property where the barn with its earthen coat stood in the summer light looking entirely unremarkable, which was itself remarkable if you knew what it had done in January. "She teach you anything else?" Samuel asked. "She's teaching me to read better," Danny said. "And she says I have a good eye for level ground." Samuel nodded slowly. He did not say anything further. But the following week he sent Danny over with a dressed side of pork hung in the Holt manner, with a particular knot that meant it was a gift and not a trade. And Eleanor understood the language of it and hung the meat and said nothing to Danny except thank you. The letter from Owen came in April, folded into an envelope that had taken 3 weeks to find its way from Pittsburgh. Eleanor sat on the step outside the barn to read it in the light of a morning that carried the first real warmth of the year. The air smelled like mud and new grass and the particular clean edge that comes when the cold finally releases its hold and the earth begins to breathe again. Owen's handwriting was precise and controlled, the way his speech was precise and controlled, the way everything about Owen organized itself into forms that did not leak or overflow. The letter was not long. He told her the weather in Pittsburgh had been difficult, which was his way of acknowledging that the winter had reached even there with some of its severity. He told her that their mother was improved significantly, improved the city air, and the rest having done what Wyoming could not. He told her their father was working as a clerk for a shipping firm on the water steady work enough to live on. Then he wrote, "I have heard some things from people who know people out there. I have heard about the winter. I have heard about what you built." Father heard too. He read the letter that came 3 times. He did not say anything to me about it, which is how I know it mattered to him. Eleanor looked up from the page at the valley spread out in front of her, still patchy with snow in the low ground, but green showing at the higher elevations. The grass coming back the way it always came back, without being asked, without requiring encouragement, because that was what it did. She looked back at the letter. Owen had written, "I was wrong about one thing. You were not making a fool of yourself. You were doing something I did not have the capacity to understand when I saw it. I am not sure I fully understand it now, but I know the difference between those two things, and I want you to know that I know it." There was no apology in the formal sense. There was no sentence containing the word sorry. That was not how Owen communicated, and Eleanor had always known it, and she read what he had written with the understanding that for Owen Vance, this letter was the equivalent of sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark and putting his hand on someone's shoulder and meaning it. She folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket because some things needed to be carried for a while before they were set down. Clara Morse came alone on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, riding the smaller of the Morse horses, a bay mare that Eleanor recognized. She came through the gate and tied the horse and came to the barn door with a basket over one arm, the kind of visit that announces itself as deliberate by everything about it. She was dressed for riding, practical and neat, and she had the air of a woman who has decided on a course of action and is not second-guessing it. Eleanor invited her in. The summer had changed the small space. The blanket partitions had come down months ago, and Eleanor had been living in the full barn through the warm season, the additional room welcome, after the contracted months of winter. The stove sat cold in the corner. The thermometer was still on the timber post. Clara set the basket on the work table. Apples dried and fresh together, a small wheel of hard cheese, a paper of salt. "I was sending you food through Ruth," Clara said, "since November." "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you." Caleb didn't know I was doing it at the time. Clara looked at her directly. She had a direct manner that Eleanor respected. "He knows now." "What did he say?" "Nothing," Clara said. And then after a pause, with Caleb, nothing is how he says that he agrees. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, and something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. It was the expression of someone who has been operating in isolation for long enough that any confirmation of connection, however small, carries a disproportionate weight. He was the first person to say the right name for it, Eleanor said. In front of Abernathy, he insisted on it. I know, Clara said. He told me, in his way. She looked around the barn at the dry walls, at the thermometer, at the notebook on the shelf. He came home from here in January, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He's not a man who sits and thinks where people can see him. When he finally came to bed, he said she did what I told her not to do, and she was right, and I was wrong, and that is the whole of it. Clara paused. For Caleb, that is a very long speech. Eleanor looked at the apple in her hand that she had taken from the basket without thinking. She turned it over once. I wasn't trying to prove him wrong, she said. I was trying to be warm. I know that, Clara said. He knows that too. Now. They sat for a while in the barn, with the summer light coming through the ventilation gaps, warm and unhurried. The way time moves when the pressure of survival has been lifted, and what remains is simply the texture of ordinary days. Clara asked about Eleanor's plans for the coming winter, practical questions about the woodpile and the food stores, and Eleanor answered with the directness of someone who has been managing these calculations alone long enough to have them always present. They talked about the Miller family's new wall, and about the Holts, and about the 7 families who were building before the frost came. When Clara stood to leave, she paused at the door. You should come for supper sometime, she said. When the season slows, Caleb would like it. Eleanor considered this. Tell him I'd like it too, she said. Clara rode out through the gate, and Eleanor watched her go with the apple still in her hand, and the afternoon stretched out around her quiet and ordinary, and full of the particular richness that ordinary days acquire after extraordinary ones. The second letter from her father came in October. It was shorter than Owen's. 2 sentences in Harold's slow, deliberate hand, the hand of a man who had never been confident with written language, but was trying. Ellie, your mother is much better. If you are willing, I would like you to write to me and tell me about the wall. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about her father's hand on her shoulder in the dark. She thought about his face turned away from her at the family table while Owen laid out the numbers. She thought about the way some men carry things they cannot speak, and how that silence can look from the outside like indifference, and how it sometimes is and sometimes is not, and how the difference between those two things matters more than most people acknowledge. She got out paper and ink. She did not write a short letter. She wrote what she knew in the order that she had learned it from the storm cellar in August, to the buffalo grass roots, to the cold that came in January with its particular fury. She wrote about the thermometer in the notebook and Danny's handwriting filling in where hers had stopped. She wrote about Caleb Morse in the chair and the tea and the 3 words he had said. She wrote about the smoke, the thin pale line on the coldest morning of the century rising straight into the sky while the valley came apart around it. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she added one more paragraph at the end, and it was the one she had not planned and did not revise. I know you did what you had to do, she wrote. I understood that then, and I understand it better now. I am not angry. I want you to know that. This is my home, and I am still here, and I am well. And what I built this winter will still be standing when everything that doubted it is gone. I would like to keep writing to you. I think there is more I want to say, and more time to say it in now that the hard part is behind us. She sealed the letter and set it on the shelf next to the notebook. In the morning, she would ride to the post. Abernathy's bulletin went out through the territorial agricultural extension in November and reached ranches and homesteads across Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, and the Dakotas by the following spring. It was 4 pages long, dense with the specific measurements and records that Abernathy had gathered, written in the flat declarative language of practical documentation. It did not read like a story, it read like evidence. It named the technique in its first paragraph and referred to it that way throughout. Vance Wall. The words appeared 17 times in 4 pages. By the winter of 1889, 19 families in Laramie County were living behind earthen walls on their north and west faces. The valley looked different from the county road, the familiar shapes of cabins and barns, altered by the dark organic profiles of the sod additions, as if the buildings had grown something, or as if the prairie had grown toward the buildings and met them partway. Danny Holt built the wall on the Holt cattle barn that autumn, the one Eleanor had promised the previous winter. He was 15 years old and he built it without asking Eleanor to supervise, though she came to look twice during the process and said nothing either time, except that the foundation course was well set. When it was finished, Samuel Holt walked around it once, pressed his boot against the base the way Morse had done at the Vance barn a year before and found it solid. "Your daughter teach you well," he said to Danny, and then corrected himself. "Miss Vance taught you well." Danny thought about this for a moment. "She showed me how to observe," he said. "The rest was just paying attention." Years passed as they do with their ordinary accumulation of seasons and changes and small necessary adjustments. Eleanor remained on the property. She added rooms to the barn, in stages proper rooms, rather than partition corners built with the knowledge of someone who now understood in her bones how structures behaved in cold. The cabin eventually came down the cottonwood, having served its purpose, and the purpose no longer requiring it. The barn and its earthen coat stood. A journalist came through the valley in 1895, working on a piece about frontier construction methods for a publication in St. Louis. He had heard about the Vance Wall from Abernathy's bulletin, which had been cited in a subsequent publication out of the Nebraska Agricultural Office, which had been read by an editor who thought the story of a technique developed not in a university, but on a single homestead, by a person without credentials might be of interest to readers who were themselves people without credentials trying to survive in difficult places. The journalist spoke to Caleb Morse first because Morse was the name most associated with the valley. He got the answer that would open his article. Then he rode out to the Vance property. Eleanor was 30 years old by then, though she looked both younger and older than that depending on the light. She showed the journalist the barn, which he examined with the evident interest of someone who has heard about a thing and is now standing in front of it and finding it smaller than he imagined, which is often how the most consequential things appear. He asked her several questions about the design, which she answered briefly. He asked her about the winter of 1888, which she described in the plainest possible terms, neither dramatizing nor minimizing. He asked her what she would say to someone who was facing the kind of situation she had faced alone and without resources, and being told by everyone around her that she was wrong. Eleanor thought about this for a moment. She looked at the barn. The earthen wall was 13 years old and growing more settled and solid with each passing season, the grasses having reestablished themselves across its surface so thoroughly that it barely looked like a construction anymore. It looked like a feature of the land. It looked like something that had always been there. "The earth is warmer than the wind," she said. "It always has been. That's not new, it's just correct." The journalist wrote that down. He also wrote down the following, which he did not quote directly in his published piece, but which he recorded in his notebook and returned to later. She said it without any sense of wanting credit for the observation. She said it the way you state a fact about weather, as something already known, waiting to be acted on. The originality, if there was any, was not in the idea. It was in the willingness to act on it alone. The barn is still standing. More than 100 winters have moved over it since Eleanor Vance laid its first course of prairie marble in the autumn of 1887. The sod has long since become indistinguishable from the hillside it adjoins, the earthen wall grown into the landscape so completely that a person riding past on the county road would not necessarily identify it as a construction. They might think it was a rise in the ground. They might think the barn had simply been built into the terrain, which in a sense it had. What Eleanor understood and what the valley came to understand through the evidence of one brutal winter was not a secret. It was not a discovery in the scientific sense. It was something older than any building in Wyoming, older than the homestead era, older than the nation whose westward expansion had brought all of them to this high cold plain. The earth holds heat. The wind takes it. These are facts of the same order as gravity, as the direction rivers run, as the angle at which the winter sun moves across the southern sky. They do not require belief. They require only observation. She had observed. She had acted on what she observed. She had done this alone without support in the face of unanimous doubt at 17 years old in the autumn of her family's departure in the winter that followed. The frontier did not reward sentiment or tradition or the weight of other men's certainty. It did not care what Caleb Morse had built in 1861 or what Thomas Abernathy had read in a building manual. It did not care about the opinion of a freighter on a trading post porch or the confident prediction of an older brother who had already made up his mind about how the story would end. It rewarded what worked. And what worked was a wall of earth 3 feet thick built by a girl who had no credentials and no teacher and no company except a 14-year-old boy with a notebook standing between a small tin stove and the worst winter in recorded Wyoming history, holding a line at 58 degrees while everything around it surrendered to the cold. That is the whole of it. The barn stands, the wall holds. The grass grows back every spring across the earthen face of it, green and persistent and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought was possible. It always does.